Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, the prospective decision by the Supreme Court of the United States of America regarding transgender treatment, particularly when it comes to minors. A rather idiotic and bizarre study that looks at shedding of vaccines and how dumb it is. Pig kidney transplants may well lead to a complete overhaul to the current donor system. The consumption of nuts and a reduced risk of dementia. The Californian squirrels have developed a taste for meat. Astronomers explain why your wishing upon a star is, wishing upon a long-since dead star. And a particular single study has effectively made a major mistake and has made a tenfold claim greater than its actual findings would suggest. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with transgender care of minors. This is at best a controversial issue, and at worst, something that's going to get this video thrown off YouTube immediately because YouTube is a bunch of pains in the ass. But let's hope for the best. The Supreme Court is looking at this for a relatively simple reason. A state has made a law that has prevented minors from receiving treatment. Essentially, if you're under 18 or thereabouts, you won't be able to transition. Now, this has, to a certain extent, been pushed back hard by activists, let's say. And the reason for this is fairly simple. The law prevents minors from transitioning, and their argument is, well, the minors need care early on to adjust to their life, and it's for their benefit. The law, by contrast, has argued that they're minors, and this is a life-changing decision, something they should make as an adult. And it looks like, at least from the Supreme Court's point of view, that's the argument they're going to go with. Or at least that appears to be the state of things based on the most recent oral arguments made. The argument being made in terms of Tennessee's ban itself is that it violates the Constitution. Now, this would, interestingly enough, be a similar argument as what was made in, say, Roe versus Wade, in which medical care and a law that either prevents or allows a form of medical care would theoretically be interfering with certain constitutional rights. And therein lies the major problem with this. Roe versus Wade was a court case that came into effect at a national level because it was a SCOTUS decision. This would affect one state, but because it's a constitutional problem, it has to go to SCOTUS to be decided. And this is where we very strongly suspect it will fall on its sword, unfortunately. The problem is very simple. The reason Roe versus Wade failed is that the SCOTUS had to make a very tortured and convoluted decision. Something that even to be blunt about it, a staunch feminist and progressive in the form of Ruth Bader Ginsburg admitted they could not support. As such, we don't expect that with more conservatives on the panel at the moment, that the decision would be any more likely to pass. In fact, the most recent decision overturning Roe versus Wade echoes a very similar mindset, and that is, it's on a state-by-state basis to make decisions as to what is being done in their state regarding healthcare, and it's not on SCOTUS to make adjudications regarding that. As a result, it's very unlikely that they will overturn the law, certainly not at the moment anyway. As such, unfortunately for the individuals who are very vociferous in this and the most pronounced activists, they're likely to lose the case and lose it hard. And next we have a study that claims that those who get the COVID-19 vaccine are shedding and causing issues. Let's be clear about this, because YouTube again is a massive pain in the ass and does not understand when we present the argument that's being made and then debunk it. They're claiming this, and we are telling you it's not true. The reason we say this is very simple. The entire study is based on survey results. Yes, and not just survey results, but survey results from a survey run over a rather long time frame. Now, it's not to say they didn't get a fair number of responses, it's just not enough to be able to claim what they're claiming. there were about 6,050 women who responded to this, which you might think, well, that's a fairly large number, isn't it? Kind of. Except when they start breaking down the individuals who responded, they split it into just two groups. They claim that there are those who basically have never been vaccinated, or at least not for COVID-19, and as such, there are about 4,000 individuals in that category, let's say, and the remainder were in groups that either received the COVID-19 vaccine or had been infected by COVID-19. You might begin to see a problem with this. This second group, assuming for whatever reason, included antivaxxers, that is the individuals who had never been vaccinated and still got COVID-19, would be in this group, and as such, they would be generating antibodies. As such, they would technically also fit into the first group, that is, exposure to COVID-19 vaccine only by proximity. Yeah. But don't worry, the study does get worse. So, we currently have a total of just over 6,000 people. Of those, they claim that 800 of them were vaccinated. They claim that there were 5,200 who were unvaccinated, which also raises massive problems around the nature of their sample. There's no real comparison to make here. You're comparing a tiny proportion to a huge proportion, and it's nowhere near representative of the actual population who has received vaccines versus not received vaccines, when you had something like 90% of the entire population vaccinated at one point. Then we have individuals who were unvaccinated and had no symptoms, and things just honestly get worse from here. But if we ignore all of the issues so far, that is, the bad statistics, the bad design, the bad sampling, and so on, we have one major problem. In no way, shape, or form have they ever presented a mechanism by which the individuals are shedding and causing the issues they're claiming. This includes things like menstrual problems and other similar female reproductive issues, let's say. And to be polite about it, we'll leave it at that, given that YouTube is again going to punish us if we be any more blunt about things. We will mention a final issue with the entire design for this, and it is very simple. They recruited respondents to this survey primarily through particular areas that are more prone, let's say, to anti-vaxxer engagement, mostly Facebook pages and similar groups. As such, their recruitment was shit. Really shit. And as such, it really can't be relied on. This is not proof of anything but bad research. Then you have, by comparison, actual studies, things like clinical research, population level studies, and so on, that looked at real world data and real world effects and found that what they're claiming isn't true. So you can look at bad research or good research and make up your mind, but the answer should be fairly obvious. Next we move to more useful clinical research, and that is a drug that should allow teeth to regrow, or possibly create fanged monstrosities. We're not sure what Japan's going for in this case, but we're going to assume regrowing teeth. This is intended to be an alternative to dentures and implants, which would be nice for many people. One of the reasons for this is that, despite seemingly having your permanent teeth permanent, given the name, they're not quite. There are in fact dormant buds for a third set of teeth that are underneath your teeth that are meant to be your final generation, your adult teeth or permanent teeth. And theoretically, if you were to stimulate them, you could theoretically regrow teeth that have fallen out. Theoretically. The reason we say that is that the Kyoto research relies on animal-based models for now, rather than humans, for rather obvious reasons. Having a mouthful of teeth is nice, having a mouthful of extra teeth, less so, and having teeth growing where they shouldn't be is a movie. Moving on, at the moment, they are in the very early stages of being able to do anything with this. But the researchers do have a very ambitious goal. They want it available for children by 2030. That is, in the next 6 years, they want to not only get this drug approved, and that would typically be for adults, but then approved for children, which generally follows well after adult approvals are done. So, This is, as said, a very optimistic goal, but theoretically, a very possible goal if things go as planned. It's not the only clinical news this week that is very promising. In fact, we have two similar items. The first is the idea that pig kidneys could be used as a replacement for human kidneys. Now, this is not new itself. After all, it's been a theoretical option for quite a while now. The problem is, pigs are not humans. As much as people may argue issues around police being pigs, police are still human. Actual pigs, as in the animal, are not, and their kidneys are the problem. You can use them for a time, but they will not last very long. The human body will begin to attack and destroy them, leading to issues. This is where an individual who donated one of their kidneys to their mother in 1999 has been able to, let's say, reap the benefits of genetic engineering. The 53-year-old woman had her other kidney begin to fail about a year later due to pregnancy-related complications. But several years later now, in fact about 20-odd years later, they've now received a genetically modified pig kidney. The genetic modification is very simple. It removes most of the markers that are intended to make it a target for the immune system to attack. Essentially, it's cloaking it, making it invisible from the immune system so that its normal vulnerabilities, and therefore its very fast expiry date, aren't there. The Alabama-based research is not incestuous, thankfully, and it's also why, theoretically, they're using pigs, because, well, it's the only way to ensure that whoever they're getting the kidney from isn't related. You might now be thinking, but haven't we heard this news before? And technically, yes, you have. There have been 2 prior transplants that have occurred. The difference between this transplant and the others is very simple. The first was an individual who was brain dead. Essentially, they just make sure that it would actually work. Can you connect all the pipes, fittings, and so on up and ensure that everything runs the way it should, for lack of a better phrase anyway. The second had to have the kidney removed due to complications, and also the patient was terminal, and as such, well, they were basically going to die regardless, which, whilst their, let's say, service is very much appreciated, it does rather give a finite amount of evidence and clinical data for what's happened. This individual, however, she will be able to keep it for life, or at least as far as her life goes, assuming there are no major complications. And as such, this should be proof, and understand we say should with a massive asterisk, that you can grow genetically modified pigs, which have large litters, grow fast, and are arguably already part of the human food chain, and therefore not have to, let's say, have massive issues around the availability of organs. But there will, of course, be various ethics concerns, but at least it does work. The other sort of clinical news we have for you is why it is that, as weird as it may sound, twins in our very early primate ancestors would have been far more common. At the moment, twins are an anomaly. Now, that's not to say they're bad, just that they are an anomaly. They are more likely in, say, elderly females, those undergoing IVF, and similar. There are all sorts of reasons, some are more theoretical than others, some are better evidence, but for the most part, the general rule is, older you are, more likely twins are to occur, IVF increases the probability, and having a history of twins in the family does the same. Then the question becomes, what's the benefit? And the benefit is, well, rather simple. The more kids you have, the more likely you are to continue the species. To quote Starship Troopers,
"You don't approve? Well, too bad. We're in this for the species, boys and girls. It's simple numbers. They have more. And every day I have to make decisions that send hundreds of people like you to their deaths."
Didn't they tell you, Colonel? That's what the mobile infantry's good for.
I hope you're ready for more. We're going back to P.
In this case, however, it's more like nature is trying to kill us, so if you make as many kids as possible, theoretically at least one of them will survive. The research itself is by no means whatsoever definitive, and it's for a very straightforward reason. They've had to try and find what could be best described as parallel species, and try and retroactively apply what we know about those species and the conserved traits within them, particularly with regards to the production of offspring, and say, if this is true currently, and we know that the trait is conserved and we go back far enough, we should theoretically find the same thing. And the question basically becomes, how far back do you have to go before twins start to become common? And, well, it's about 60 million years ago. Yeah, and so we are going quite a ways back. In other nutty news, we actually have nut news, and it has to do with dementia. No, it's not that kind of nut. Not these nuts either. It is literally, eating nuts appears to reduce your risk of dementia. It's kind of dodgy research. It's not dodgy in that it's bad, it's that what they've done is look at a massive data set and try and retroactively apply certain outcomes and see what trends fit. Yes, they used a large data set, about 50,000 individuals, and it's all data from the UK Biobank, so it's not a bad data source, it's just, understand, it is fundamentally an issue around, have they found what they actually think they've found, or is this just a weird anomaly in the data? Or, worse yet, is it true that what they found is there, but their reasoning is wrong? And we'll get to that shortly. What they found is that if you're over 60 and you don't eat as many nuts, you wind up having a higher risk of dementia. If you consume at least 30 grams of nuts a day, you had a 16% lower risk of dementia. Okay, simple numbers, straightforward. However, the caveats are clear. What they found was that there was no association for men, particularly across age groups. So that's already a problem. We also found issues regarding their obesity results, sleeping results. There was also issues around, there were all sorts of other problems, but for now we'll just focus on those, along with the fact that they haven't adjusted for things around the socioeconomics and similar. To be blunt about it, if you can afford to buy the variety of nuts on a regular basis and consume them in that kind of quantity, there's a good chance that you are at least better off financially. As a result, you're not likely to be suffering from the various problems and difficulties of somebody who isn't as well off, and so we now have a confounding variable in the form of socioeconomics. There is, however, a parallel line of evidence that does at least somewhat support what they say, and that is a varied and reasonably well-balanced diet does generally contribute to a lower risk of things like dementia. However, that does also support the concerns around whether or not they've adjusted for socioeconomics and similar. Generally speaking, the more varied and balanced your diet is, the more likely you are to be at least better off financially, employment-wise, health-wise, and so on. But it is still at least somewhere to start from. It's just not a great place to start at the moment, because it's still a very flaky research. Less flaky, and arguably more worrying, particularly if you find these flakes, viruses in milk. Yeah. Now, the viruses in milk are actually worse, not because we actually have an issue with finding them. In fact, given what it is, we'd expect to find them. It's because they're being found in raw milk that's being refrigerated. Typically speaking, you would expect a virus to die off fairly quickly, and for good reason. There's no host inside the milk for the viruses to survive in. They basically have to try and get by with whatever is in them and maintain their state. Well, that shouldn't last very long. It shouldn't. But according to this study, there's about a 2.5 day longevity for the virus in cold milk. Cold in this situation being about 4 degrees Celsius or just under 40 degrees in freedom units. You need 2.5 days to get rid of 99% of the virus. That is the avian influenza virus that's been spreading throughout the world and causing all sorts of grief with regards to the availability of eggs, chicken, and, well, obviously now milk, although thankfully in this case raw milk, which should never have been available in the first place. As the researchers also show, when you pasteurize the milk, you basically activate all of the virus. So you don't need to wait 2.5 days to be able to consume your milk and still have a risk of being infected. You can just have it pasteurized and have zero risk of infection. You know, the common sense solution. But we are talking common sense, which is neither sense nor common now, which is rather sad. More so when we consider that, historically at least, and certainly at the most recent evidence, avian influenza has a good chance of a 50% fatality rate. In far more entertaining and bizarre news, we have squirrels, Californian squirrels, who have developed a taste for meat. Yeah, they're not quite zombies yet, but considering that we know they already have a good probability of carrying either rabies or plague, their desire to eat meat is worrying to say the least. For something that's meant to be so cute, or in the case of certain movies such as Ice Age, the cause of global catastrophes, yeah, they're definitely a worry. This is where the research is interesting again, basically because it's not really something that's been observed much before. The observations were made by watching what's going on with a whole bunch of squirrels near a park in Contra Costa County. They admittedly only watched them for a short time, between June and July, but they did make 74 observations of interactions involving the ground squirrel, and 42% of them involved hunting smaller rodents. Now, that also indicates that you could make an arguable case for cannibalism, along with carnivores, which, we have rabies, plague, carnivores, and cannibalism. We might actually manage to fill our bingo card for zombies this year. But no, it might actually be something far more, let's say, basic than that. According to the data from things like the iNaturalist app, the predation of smaller, let's say, rodents is based on the surge in population around that time, particularly of voles, which may indicate that there is a, let's say, abundance of food that the squirrels are suddenly taking advantage of. Or it could well mean that squirrels are turning nasty. And next we have more human-related food news, although this time rather more direct, and that is, if you swap out your cow milk for example, plant-based milk, you could actually be losing essential nutrients, which may sound like we're shilling for big milk here, but hear us out. This is not going to be news to a lot of people who, say, consume oat milk or similar. There are issues around the production of various plant-based milks. The first is simply getting the milking cup on the tiny nuts, or the plant you're getting the milk from, because it's really hard to find the udder of a plant. But a serious actual research looks at what 10 different kinds of plant-based milk, or alternatives to basically cow milk, have when it comes to not only the process of heating it, particularly UHT or ultra heat treatment, and the actual content of it from a nutritional point of view. Researchers looked at things like the total amino acids that were in there, various ferrophils, acrylamides, sugars, and similar other content. Some of this may sound like nonsense terminology to you, but bear with us and we'll hopefully make it clear shortly. When you look at the actual heat treatment process, some of the more essential amino acids get lost, and this is basically a result of how you heat treat it. You damage the proteins, and the protein basically makes it inaccessible. It's not a perfect explanation, but it's close enough for government work. The next is the Maillard reaction products, which are another way you could theoretically prevent the amino acids from being accessible, along with various sugars, and we have a video on what the Maillard reaction involves, and you'll find it linked both in the top right and below. The other concern, particularly if you live in the state of California, is that your milk will now have to carry the label of being a possible carcinogen. They found acrylamide, the same thing that things like, say, Starbucks had to have all their coffee cups marked as being a possible carcinogen for. Yeah, this is going to turn all the California hipsters on their head. It's entirely possible you could power a large part of California for quite a while based on how much that was spinning. That's important as a finding though, because you don't typically find acrylamide in liquid food. Yeah, that's why it's kind of weird. It's not the only thing they've found, but it's one of the concerning things. It's also possibly because they've been roasting almonds to get their nut milk, but we'll avoid the possible jokes from that. There's also issues around environmental tolls and so on, but then again you could make arguments around the effect of cow milk for the same reason. And now for why this may not be a surprise. There's actually a fairly well-known history, particularly if you've ever dealt with people who are, say, vegan or similar, wherein things like, say, soy milk or oat milk had to be swapped out on a regular basis because it lacked certain essential vitamins, nutrients, minerals, or in this case, things like, say, amino acids, and it had to do with the extraction and production process for it. As a result, you do need to be aware of the fact that, yes, it could theoretically be useful, particularly if you're looking at it for dietary reasons. It also might well be that, well, it's actually not good for you, but far more future research is definitely required before making that claim. In fact, we might as well be wishing upon a dead star if we were to make that claim, and it's what a lot of people do. They're wishing upon a star. There's more than a 50-50 chance that that star will be dead. Millions of years ago, mind you. And it's not just dead, but it's gone. It's just taking forever to let us know. And so we have an astronomer explaining, yeah, this is actually a fool's errand. The majority of the stars that we can see have a maximum distance of what you can see of about 10,000 light years from Earth, which means the light you're seeing now was sent out from that star about 10,000 years ago. But 10,000 years is a relatively long time. And so, if you're seeing it now, you may not be seeing it if you were to live that long. It's simply going to take that long before you figure out what's happening. The curse of mortality. The article from the conversation does give you a good indicator of which stars are actually a suitable option to look at and wish upon if you want to be reasonably confident that you aren't doing so in vain hope, let's say. Someone who may want to find out which of these stars to wish upon are the astronauts, still stuck on the ISS. Yeah, they were only meant to be there for a couple of weeks, and they've basically been there for many, many months now. They're celebrating Christmas unexpectedly, which, hey, at least it's something different. There are very few people who could say that they've spent Christmas in space. Of course, they may not wish to say they spent Christmas in space. It's not on their plan, and the reason for this is that, well, the Starliner's propulsion system during the flight appeared to have a problem, and meaning there's been more delays. Admittedly, Starliner's efforts have been far less promising than SpaceX's efforts, so yeah. What was meant to be a November return to Earth is now a March 2025 return to Earth, and the way things are going now, it may not ever be a return to Earth. But perhaps we're being overly cynical. The final article we have is an interesting, let's say, screw-up from quite a few years back, and it's how a small error in the math of a study led to things like, say, black plastic kitchen utensils being overly estimated for their danger. And this is not to say they are perfectly safe, only that there was a significant over-calculation on the actual risk. In fact, it was a 10-fold increase in risk. Yes. As the chemist interviewed for this explained, they're not a math wizard as such, but they're not bad at math either. But they understand if you multiply 60 by 7,000 to get 42,000, there seems to be a small error. Now, this is an instance where we won't accuse it of being malicious. This appears to just be an inept ability to do simple arithmetic by an advocacy group, and it is actually research published by an advocacy group, or at least supported by it, which does explain some of the particular errors and weird bias to the research, but nevertheless, the research is flawed, significantly so. So this brings us back to the flawed maths. If you multiply 60 by 7,000, you don't get 42,000, which is what the researchers were claiming. You get 420,000. Yeah. The other issue here is that the entire premise of this is on a 60 kilogram adult, and the other thing to note is that the, let's say, approved weight or approved dose is 7,000 nanograms per kilogram of body weight per day, hence the value of 60. So if you take your 7,000, multiply by 60, you get 420,000. The amount the researchers found as a daily dose is 34,700. Now, already, this is below the limit, which is 42,000 as they claimed originally, and not even 1/10 of the limit of the actual value they should have gotten. Yeah. They essentially overstated the significance of what they found by 10-fold. Yeah, understand, we're not talking about a small typo here. The typo fundamentally changes the findings of what they've concluded. You can no longer claim that you're approaching any percentage of the daily limit of any significance when you lose that much of what you're talking about. It goes from being 80% down to 8%. We can only hope that the correction gets published before long and is very clearly listed, so that the original research as it's been published is not floating around there with this nonsense attached to it. Well, the nonsense will still be attached to it, but at least it'll be clearly specified that they screwed up in a particular way, and what their findings should have been. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.